Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Industry Insights. I'm your host, Leah Trushnecki, and I am joined by two wonderful guests. Jeff Reichert joins us from our product strategy team, and Adam Berg joins us from our GSI team as well. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I think a lot of our viewers know me. I'm on all the time. I work on our product strategy team, and I work a lot with our enterprise customers around their compliance requirements and with our global systems integrator partners.
And hi, everyone. I'm Adam Berg. I'm a global technical director here at Veeam. So, what I really do and what I'm really passionate about is making sure that when we're talking about the most important data workloads for some highly regulated industries, we're bringing in the deep technical knowledge, the architectures, thinking about compliance regulation, thinking about how we design and architect to create an environment where data is protected and secured, no matter where that data resides, whether that's on-prem or in the public cloud or hybrid, or anywhere in between. And working with Jeff and developing those critical capabilities for our partners is really what I'm passionate about. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think, one of the things we're really excited to talk today about is kind of what uniquely affects healthcare organizations in the data protection space. We're fortunate at Veeam to work with organizations of all shapes and sizes, of all remits. And honestly, most of the best practices that we talk about apply to everyone. Most of the outcomes that we talk about apply to everyone. But as regulations change, as remits change, we do see some kind of unique aspects in some of these verticals, and in particular in the healthcare space. We're really excited to chat more about what we think is uniquely affecting CIOs, IT leaders within these healthcare organizations. So, Jeff, I want to start with you. Obviously, you spend a lot of time in the field talking with these kinds of organizations. What do you hear from CIOs and IT leaders within these organizations? What's top of mind for them?
Well, I will borrow a phrase that we in the United States, and it is an election year, so this is something that we're reading and we're hearing as we go through our elections. It's the economy, stupid. We hear from healthcare organizations all the time that cost is a major driver that they are dealing with. I took a look at some PricewaterhouseCoopers numbers around this from this year's survey that they did of the healthcare industry in general. What PricewaterhouseCoopers research has found is that the average healthcare provider margin went pre-pandemic from 7% to currently 4.7%. And when you think about the fact that the COVID pandemic had a lot of direct effects on revenues for healthcare practices, for hospitals, for doctors. There were a lot of deferred care decisions that were made, a lot of deferred procedures that were done that really made a significant harmful financial impact on the healthcare system globally. And if you then think that while inflation globally has gotten largely under control, it is not entirely under control. PricewaterhouseCoopers expects that the costs for healthcare providers in the United States specifically are going to rise 8% by the end of 2025, which is a very big number if you then look and realize that the margins are down, the profit margins for these providers are down close to 3% since pre-pandemic. So there's an awful lot of cost pressure that the whole healthcare industry is under right now. And I don't have a conversation about this where cost is not either item one or item two on the list of things we talk about.
Yeah, and especially when I think they're so innovation focused, it's really hard to then make some of those challenging choices and those trade-offs. I'm ex-Microsoft. I talk about that a lot on the show. And one of our core concepts at Microsoft was do more with less. And so when we think about that as it applies to healthcare organizations, they're having to do a lot more with perhaps flat budgets. Again, a lot of those trade-offs. So Jeff, what do you think a lot of these organizations are trying to accomplish here?
Well, to use another buzzword from 2024, it wouldn't be a tech industry presentation if I didn't use the words AI or the letters AI. So I've got to say that. I think anyone who has followed the healthcare space is keenly aware of some of the use cases that ultimately will improve patient outcomes and drive down costs in healthcare. Things like large language model enabled analysis of digital studies, things like radiology, stuff like that, that can be greatly sped up, can be greatly enhanced by AI enhancement. There are a lot of different use cases that are out there. But of course, the issue with AI is that if you really want to take advantage of it, it's often not cheap to do. And if you want to take advantage of some of the economies of scale that, to use your example, Microsoft, for example, with their partnership with OpenAI, can help organizations drive, then you might be looking at putting some of your data, or at least doing some of that work, up in the cloud, which opens even further the whole can of worms that a lot of healthcare IT leaders and IT security leaders are dealing with around hybrid infrastructure. What do I move to the cloud? What am I driving? And what do I have to deal with when I do that?
Yeah, and Adam, I want to bring you in on this because I know you spent a lot of time talking with healthcare organizations as
Yes.
well. And when we look at how different organizations approach cloud hosting and managing hybrid infrastructures, some are much more conservative, but some are much more focused on the innovation and benefits that can come from cloud technology. And I think healthcare is kind of uniquely positioned to want to focus on investments in cloud. So talk to us a little bit about what it means to have a hybrid infrastructure in today's healthcare organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to a lot of healthcare CIOs and CTOs, and what's really turning a lot of hair gray is how do we leverage the hybrid cloud due to the cost pressures that Jeff was talking about, right? I think, it's inevitable that a lot of that core healthcare data, the crown jewels, electronic medical records, radiology, imaging, is moving into the cloud for those cost pressures. But what they're thinking about is how do I maintain governance and compliance around this data? And it's not just things like HIPAA regulations in the United States or GDPR. There's other real industry regulations that apply to healthcare, like NIS2 and SOCIA, and like these regulations that they're thinking about as well that have real teeth to them. They're thinking about how do I maintain uh, the security posture, the governance, the access controls around this data as I extend my data center to the public cloud. I think healthcare data centers, more often than any other industry, they want that lock and key and security wall around that data more than any other industry. Because when we start thinking about medical records, minutes of outage means real healthcare outcome differences for their populations, right? So we start talking about attack surface, threat vectors as we extend the data center to the public cloud. And I think these are the issues that we talk about in healthcare more often than potentially any of these other industries. And I think these are deep technical conversations that we need to have when we start talking about healthcare and extending to the hybrid cloud.
And Jeff, I want to bring you in on this next piece because I think when we talk about something that's top of mind for CIOs, CISOs, IT leaders in the healthcare space, it has to be these big news-making events when it comes to cyber incidents and cyber attacks. So you want to talk a little bit about this, kind of recent news-making event that happened?
Yeah, it doesn't get much bigger and more news-making. The Change Healthcare, United Healthcare ransomware attack that happened back in late February, March of this year. The estimates by United Healthcare are that the economic impact of that attack ranged from 2.3 to 2.45 billion, yes, billion with a B, dollars of total damage to that company. Now, United Healthcare is a huge company. They've got large amounts of revenues, but the effect of this outage on the entire US healthcare system, on billings, on payments throughout systemically, the United Healthcare system was a real wake-up call. What we've seen is that when this kind of attack happens, when this kind of outage happens, it becomes personal for senior leadership at the organization. No leader in any of your organizations, for those of you who are viewing today, wants to be in Andrew Whitty's position, testifying before a very joint, bilateral, cooperative set of Democrats and Republicans who all wanted to pile on and say, how on earth could this have happened? Is United too big to fail? What were your deficiencies? And of course, it did turn out, as we often hear in these kind of cases, that the deficiencies were compromised accounts and systems that didn't have multi-factor authentication in place that led ultimately to this giant outage of payment systems that affected the whole healthcare industry. This is why it's so important to get a grip on this kind of threat and risk, and why, I mentioned the very cooperative Republican and Democrat piling on poor Mr. Whitty after this outage. We're seeing a lot of movement in the regulatory space, as Adam mentioned before as well, partly because of how important healthcare is and what a systemically important part of the economy and of society it is.
Yeah, and I think when we look at kind of what comes next naturally, it is added regulations. It is tightening of those expectations. So, Jeff, why don't you talk to us a little bit about some of those regulations that we see popping up and what's top of mind for these healthcare leaders?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the NIS2 directive in the EU, which is an update to an earlier information security directive, applies to critical industries. There are critical industries and then there are important industries. If you take a look, you will notice that the health sector, if we list that, is going to be listed there. What NIS2 requires specifically is a set of minimum cybersecurity requirements, managing your crisis management, getting your incident response down, getting controls in place in line with the ISO 27001 standard. And as we've seen with a lot of other recent regulation, in addition to that duty of care, it contains a duty to report. So you will now, just like with GDPR, where you have to report data breaches, you will have to report cyber incidents like ransomware attacks or any severe outage in the same way. One thing that we have seen with all kinds of regulation of this sort, whether it is the SEC rules that went into place last year for United States publicly traded companies that also included mandatory reporting periods, is that when you add duties to report, it really makes organizations get a lot more crisp about their incident response planning and about how they deal with the threat of cyber attacks. If we go to the next slide, and I alluded to this briefly before, who does NIS2 apply to? Well, it applies to both critical and important industries. I'm not going to look at important, but for critical industries, you'll notice healthcare is listed here, financial services is listed here, a lot of things that obviously we would think of, drinking water, energy, wastewater, transportation, et cetera, that really have to be working right for society to keep humming along. One of the reasons this is important right now, if we look at the conflict in the Ukraine that's still dragging on, we have seen that in modern political and armed conflicts, the cyber arena is very, very much part of this theater. And so one of the reasons that we find regulators in both the EU and around the world, in North America and in Asia, taking this kind of threat seriously is because it's very much recognized that geopolitical conflicts, as well as bad actions from criminal actors, can spill over and have terrible, wide-ranging effects for normal citizens in a host of areas. Now, I mentioned that this is actually international. We talked about NIS2. If we go to the next slide that we've got, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, which the acronym is CIRCIA, was passed in March 2022. The comments period closed on it in July of 2024. As the name might indicate, one of the critical things, and again, this drives a lot of behavior, is a mandatory incident reporting period, 24 hours for any ransomware payment, 72 hours for covered incidents, which basically means any significant cybersecurity incident. One of the really interesting things about this is that the 16 critical industries, and we'll look at what those are in the US context in just a second, but the 16 critical industries that were previously loosely regulated by the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency had previously been regulated by sector-specific regulatory agencies. So CISA basically oversaw what the industry-specific regulatory agencies did, and they all had obviously slightly different rule sets. One of the big differences that the CIRCIA Act pulls into place is that sort of patchwork of regulations for energy, for financial services, for healthcare, for communications industries are all going to get much, much more standardized under the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which again is only going to be a good thing because it's going to drive consistency. It's going to give the organizations that are part of this industry and the organizations serving these critical industries a much more stable, common set of goals to aim at. If we look at what the industries are, I'll just be selfish for a minute. We've been talking about healthcare, but if we look at the 16 critical industries, yep, do we have that slide? There we go. If we look at these industries, obviously healthcare is one of them, but from a selfish standpoint, Veeam is on this list too. We're actually on this list twice, both because we're in the information technology space, but also because we are a major supplier to the United States Department of Defense. And so the defense industrial base, which at last count I saw includes over 300,000 private companies that sell goods or services to the US Department of Defense. All of those organizations, because they're part of that base, are going to find themselves ruled by this. But of course, the healthcare industry, which is what we're talking about today, is an obvious, clear component, a clear critical infrastructure player.
But certainly, I think it's helpful to recognize that because Veeam is on this list in so many capacities, healthcare organizations can kind of rest assured that third-party vendors like Veeam are held to the same expectations that they are. And Adam, I want to bring you on this last point because I think this is overwhelming for a lot of organizations to contend with, right? And we're seeing changes to these regulations happen. We're seeing differences perhaps in different geographies. And while a lot of healthcare organizations tend to be regional, so they may only be governed by certain sets of regulations, others are not. Others are multinational. So Adam, your work is really spending a lot of time with our global systems integrators. Talk to us a little bit about how those GSIs can help, especially when compliance and ultimately cyber resilience is a team sport.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about this all the time, right? Maintaining cyber resilience, cybersecurity is a team sport. Working with your GSI partners, those are your global system integrators, they're uniquely positioned because they're working with the largest organizations, multinationals, and they have a deeper understanding of the regulations as they apply across different geographies, different locations, and across critical industry. And what that means is you're working with the most knowledgeable organizations in the world, right? They're bringing together the multitude of different technologies that will ultimately keep your environments secure, right? We talk about this all the time, when we talk to CIOs. We talk about left of the boom, right of the boom, right? The boom is sort of like maybe an incident that's happening in your environment. We need controls and technology that is upfront. Things like intrusion detection platforms, information firewalling, these kinds of technologies. We kind of think these as preventative technologies, and then technologies that are right of the boom, right? Technologies that help you recover and detect cyber incidents. But what's really critical and what we're talking a lot more, especially in the context of the regulations that Jeff was just talking about, is incident response planning and preparedness, and also forensic investigation and recovery as key components to maintaining compliance with a lot of the new cyber regulations that are coming out. GSIs are uniquely positioned because they're developing whole practices around incident response, forensic investigation and recovery, and even Veeam has a role to play with in this too. We've got a team now called the Coveware team that helps respond within 15 minutes of an ongoing cyber attack, immediately starting to do forensic analysis, building a detection algorithm so that when we start recovering data immediately, we're not getting reinfected from a cyber attack, right? I don't think people realize the level of reinfection that happens after a cyber attack. I mean, all of these kinds of things, the GSIs partnering with Veeam are thinking about, and we're attacking and helping organizations like healthcare and regulated industries to maintain their compliance.
Really exciting to be able to partner with some of the leaders in this space to bring expertise in. We recognize that everything we talked about today is not just about technology, it's people, process, and tech coming together. And we need these experts to step in, especially when so much of what we're all contending with has to happen behind the scenes, in the shadows. We recognize that, again, you saw that news article from earlier. These can be news-making events that dramatically impact your organization's brand and reputation. So pulling together the experts to make it that team sport is so critical. And it is all about staying ahead. So, we just wanted to highlight some resources that Veeam makes available as well. So if you want to download these resources, share them with your teams. Of course, the Veeam team is also here to help. We're all on LinkedIn. So, of course, you can reach out to us at any time. We'd love to chat with you further. But with that, thank you all so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to chat with you all as experts in this space. We obviously have the privilege of talking with so many different kinds of organizations, but I can't think of a mission more important than achieving great patient outcomes. So for those of you all in the healthcare space, thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are partners of ours, thank you for supporting that mission. We hope that this was valuable for you all. Thank you again for this week's Industry Insights, and we hope to catch you on the next episode.